again, a very warm welcome. This webinar will be about getting the most out of the primary guided course. My name is Fiona. I am Head of Content here at Language Nut. I took over from our previous Head of Content earlier this year. My background is as a secondary teacher, but I had a lot of input in this primary guided course, and I have taught quite a bit of languages at primary as well over the years. So really looking forward to sort of talking about the guided course today. Generally, this session is going to be looking to begin with at an overview of the course. I know that a lot of people today will have already potentially been subscribed to Language Nut and our sort of open resources for primary, so maybe you're here to get a bit more of a feel for what the guided course is all about. So we'll do a brief overview of that, as well as then looking more closely this session about using our knowledge organisers and our lesson plans and how to use them in conjunction with the primary guided course and the different types of lesson that we have on the course. As it mentioned in the blurb for the webinar, we predominantly are aiming this at sort of early career teachers or non-specialists, as we do believe that that's sort of particularly where this course is super helpful, as it is very handheld. Obviously, if you are joining us and you're a sort of seasoned language teacher in the primary classroom, do stick around. There might be some sort of things that will jolt in your memory, but I promise I'm not trying to teach you to how to suck eggs, but it'll be a really good overview today of what we've got to offer on the primary guided course. And as I said, if you do have any questions throughout the session, do pop them in the Q&A. As I said, my colleague Dave will be collecting those as we go along, and we'll have a bit of time to go through those towards the end, and I'll do my best to answer any questions that you might have. One thing I will draw your attention to before we get started is, as I mentioned, this is a start of a sort of series, a three-part series of webinars related to our primary guided course. Today is, as I said, more of an introductory overview session, talking about how to use the wider resources on the course, like the lesson plans, knowledge organisers, in conjunction with the front of class slides. But we will then be running on the Thursday, the 5th of October, we're running a session looking at using Language Nut primary guided course to engage and motivate pupils. So that will be looking largely at the games that we have already on our platform, as well as sort of the games that we have sort of in the lesson plans that aren't necessarily hosted on Language Nut, looking at those kind of common games. And again, particularly if you're a non-specialist or an early careers teacher that hasn't had a huge amount of experience teaching languages in the primary classroom, it'll give you an idea for the kind of games that we use and can use that really sort of pique students' interest and get them really involved in their language lessons. And then on the 12th of October, we will have our third in this series to do with the primary guided course, which will be looking at using the primary guided course to deliver a personalised learning experience. So we'll be really looking at our extension activities, our support activities, and how you can use the guided course to really stretch, challenge and support the various learners in your classroom. So do sign up for those. Everything today will be recorded, as will these, and if you do want slides, I'll have an email for you to contact towards the end of the session for you to sort of look at the slides in conjunction with the recording, which will also be sent out afterwards. Brilliant. So without further ado, we'll move on and look at sort of overview of the guided course. So some of you might have seen this already, and this is a sort of very top level overview of the content that we have for French. Spanish will be very similar, but obviously particularly the cultural sections will be slightly different for Spanish. You can see that we've obviously broken down year 3, 4, 5, 6 into autumn, spring and summer terms. You'll be able to see that every single year group starts the autumn term with a greetings lesson. We know that not every year 5 teacher will have taught the year 3 content or the year 4 content, and you also might have children joining you from other schools where they maybe taught another language or didn't teach languages at all. So we do think it's really important to go over that greetings vocabulary, the hello, how are you, all of those items at the beginning of the year, just to really set that routine. And what you'll see later is that sort of greetings vocabulary becomes part of the sort of starting routine for all of the lessons across the whole of the guided course as well. You can see at the end of each of our sort of big terms, the autumn and spring terms, we will have a sort of dedicated culture lesson. Again, you'll see in these ones, it's not so much about learning words or phrases, it's more to do with getting students really interested in the culture, be that the French-speaking world or the Spanish-speaking world for Spanish. We do have full modules that are related to cultural topics such as cities or food, and topics that look at things like Francophone countries and Spanish-speaking countries, but these lessons are sort of more standalone and are sort of there for you at the end of term and have a lot of sort of media and other activities in them as well. And then finally, at the end of every big term, summer term, we tend to have a project-based lesson, which usually covers a couple of lessons, and it might be something like French menu or something about me, where students produce something slightly larger and brings together everything that they've covered throughout the year. That's an overview of the content. And as you'll see when you log into the guided course, I think most people here today are already subscribers, so you probably will have already seen this screen. I won't be going into too much detail today about sort of the admin side of things in terms of setting up classes. That's something that if you've already got a subscription and you're having any issues with setting up classes or anything along those lines, please do. I'll share the email at the end of this session for our customer support team, who'll be able to really sort of guide you through how to do that. But as you'll know, when you come into the primary guided course, you'll be able to select the class you're teaching from the classes you've set up. You'll then be able to select your language, French or Spanish, and select the year group of the class that you're teaching. So for now, go into French Year 3. And you will then be taken through to our sort of overall dashboard for that year group. And this is a sort of smaller bird's eye view of, obviously one year group, whereas before it was the overview of all the year groups. As you can see, we've broken them down into half terms. And each half term has about 6 lessons. You can tick lessons off as you go along, either from this screen or from your lesson dashboard, so you can get a really good view when you go into that class of where you've got to in that term or in that year. As I mentioned before, we have various different types of lesson. We'll be looking at a couple of different types of lessons further on in the session. But just to draw your attention to a few from here, you can see that at the end of every sort of half term, the first half term of each big term, we have what's called a competition week. In that week, what we've done is put together a big vocabulary set of all the vocabulary that's been covered in that half term, as a chance for you to go back over some of the vocabulary that you've covered. If you wanted to sort of set that as task for students to go away and have a go with the various different LanguageNut games, you can do that in this week. And it's also potentially a buffer week where actually if you had missed out one of the lessons for whatever reason during that half term, you could go back and cover that again during that week. We also have at the end of every big term a sentence building and competition week, and we'll be looking more closely at a lesson plan for one of those weeks in a moment. The main idea of those weeks obviously is that it is a sentence building week, and it will bring together the vocabulary that's been covered in that whole term at a sentence level. So it really gets that stage where you're building progression, moving from the vocabulary level to a sentence building level. And that is a week where we do really encourage in that week, if you're not a school that uses devices week in, week out, or if you don't have access to them all the time, if you do have the ability to book out some computers or devices, to book that out for that week so that you can get a competition going and you can get students using those devices. If you are already using LanguageNut and you want to know how to set up a competition for your different classes or within a class, then that's something that we can help you with. If you get in touch with our customer support team, they can show you exactly how to do that. But yes, the sentence building is where we really do encourage use of devices for that particular week. You can see as well we've got phonics lessons woven in through the different half term. The phonics again will follow a very, very similar structure in terms of you'll have a lesson plan, you'll have a lesson dashboard. I'm not going to go into too much detail with phonics this week because we'll be looking at that in the game session on the 5th of October. But just to draw your attention to the fact that you do have phonics lessons built in throughout that are linked to the phonics content that some of you will have already seen in our open resources section. And then finally, you've got those culture or project lessons towards the end of every big term. You can see there in term 3.2, that week 5 and 6 just means that the content in that project about me covers 2 weeks worth of content. Brilliant. So that covers our sort of overview of the course. We're going to look now in a bit more detail at how you would use knowledge organisers and particularly how we're going to use lesson plans in conjunction with the primary guided course. So in order to access the knowledge organiser for each half term, you can see when you go into the course dashboard for a particular year group or class, you can see that you've got that printer button. If you click on that, that will take you to a pack that includes the knowledge organiser as well as all of the lesson plans for that half term. Now, the knowledge organiser is something that you can choose to share with parents. You could share it on your school website. You can share it with students if you want to as well. And it's also just a really useful thing that you can have sort of printed out in, on your desk in the front of the classroom, so that if you have anybody asking, what are the students covering in French this half term or Spanish this half term, you've just got a really, really quick document that you can just hand over and show to anybody wanting to know what you're covering. There are 4 main sections on the Knowledge Organiser. One is the aims for that half term, which gives a brief overview of what's being covered on that half term. The second section is the vocabulary, and this is the key vocabulary for the half term. So if you do have, for example, a cultural lesson that has vocabulary like the different areas of Paris, that's not necessarily going to be included on here because it's not vocabulary that we really want students to sort of learn and come away with sort of very much embedded in their memory at the end of that half term. So it'll be very much the key vocabulary for the half term. You'll also have any grammar that is covered, and you'll have a full explanation and paradigm here. This isn't necessarily going to be taught as a paradigm to the students. We're not expecting necessarily for year 3s to know the full conjugation of alle, but it's more there for you and for sort of anybody who you think needs some extra information about that, and that's covered in the grammar section. And then finally, we also have a phonics section, which shows the phonics that are covered over that half term as well. So obviously in this first half term, we cover the sounds and that gives then also a sort of explanation of how those sounds are produced. So as I said, the Knowledge Organiser really is a sort of snapshot of what's going on in that half term, and something that's for you or can be shared with students as well. So looking at lesson planning, and how we'd use the guided course and the different resources we have for lesson planning. And we're going to look at a few different areas of our dashboard and what we'd want to, ideally the steps that we'd be taking in order to deliver a lesson on the guided course. So we're going to go, in order to get to an individual lesson, you just click on the week. So in this case, week 1 greetings, and you'll be taken to the lesson dashboard. And this is really here for you as something that you can dip into quickly. So on the right hand side, you've got the learn screen for that lesson. So if you go into the learn screen, that's something that you can do going into this week. Before you've shown it with your class, you can go into the learn screen and get a really quick snapshot of the vocabulary that's going to be covered in that lesson. This will also be included in the front of class slides, but it's also a great place where you can sort of get to grips with the vocabulary that's been covered that week. It would be from here as well that if you want students, if you're either following a sort of flipped learning approach where you want students to be familiar with the vocabulary before the lesson, or if you want students using devices during the lesson, or if you want to assign vocabulary for homework or for a different sort of lesson during the week, it's from here, this learn screen, you can assign this vocabulary. So if you assign the vocabulary from the learn screen, that means that your children, the students in your class, will be able to access all of the different LanguageNut games that are available for vocabulary learning, and means that you could do that. You could then get them out on devices in a lesson, you can get them assigning it for homework, or it can just be an open-ended assignment that they can then access whenever they want to as well. So you can access that from the learn screen. The other areas on that dashboard, so the reading, that is the reading activity that's included in the front of class slides. There's also an extension, support and quiz activity. Then more there is a front of class thing that you could dip into maybe in the morning if you've got spare time, or any time at the end of the day to dip into. But we'll go more into the extra side of things in our webinar when we look at stretch and challenge further on in the term. Another thing you want to think about when planning your lesson, before we've got to the point where we are actually delivering it to the children, is whether or not you've got any children that would benefit from having a vocabulary list out in front of them during the class. So in order to get this, you can go on our print resources, and then that will take you to an area where you can print off a vocabulary list. There are also various other things that you can print off from this section, such as dice, snap, word search activities as well. But it's from here that you can then download a printable with as much or as little of the vocabulary from that lesson as you want on there. So if you do have any children that you think would benefit from having that vocabulary on the table in front of them during the class, then you can get that ready before the lesson and download it and print it out before you get started. Now, moving on to the actual lesson plans itself, obviously you can access that from the Knowledge Organiser package that you can get from the dashboard, or you can get it from the lesson plans section from the actual sort of lesson dashboard as well. So we're going to go into quite a lot of detail with these lesson plans before showing you a couple of different types of lessons. So the lesson plans all follow this setup where you have the vocabulary for the lesson in the top right. So that's there written down for you. You then have a section called Extension Support and Variations, which is essentially just ideas for extension activities, ideas for how you might support students, ideas for what you might do if you're at a school that uses lots of devices. And it also gives you ideas for homeworks and any cross-curricular links as well. Again, as I mentioned, we'll be doing an entire webinar on support and challenge further on in the term, so we'll focus on that section more then, but just so you know, that's what that section is there for you. We then also have a resources section, which shows you any of the activities, LanguageNut activities that we'd be doing in that week, as well as any other resources that you might need for the lessons. That might be a tennis ball one week, it might be some scrap paper, it might be another printout that's included in the lesson plan as well. And so all of that's listed there for you. Finally, we also have our grammar hints section. And again, this isn't necessarily something that has to be taught explicitly to students. Obviously, it can be shared with them if you have somebody who's particularly inquisitive about a certain grammar point. This is something that you could share with them as a sort of stretch activity. But it's more just for you if, when preparing for your lesson, you want to know a little bit more about the language that you're teaching during that lesson. You can have a read through this and hopefully feel a little bit more confident about what you're delivering. So moving on to the teaching and learning activities, so every single lesson plan has a very, very step-by-step approach to teaching the lesson, and all of this then links to the front of class slides that you can access through your lesson dashboard. You can see from this example and the next example that every single lesson starts with either a hook or a recall activity. So the hook will be something to pique students' interest. It might be just like an introductory activity or just a word on the board, whereas a recall activity is more likely to be a game based on the vocabulary from last lesson, and if that is sort of particularly relevant to this lesson coming through as well. When you go into the front of class slideshow from your dashboard, as you will see, every single lesson will start with a title slide with learning outcomes. You'll then have, after the very first lesson in year 3, you'll have the slide that includes that greetings vocabulary that I mentioned before, that everybody will do at the beginning of the year. And again, this is somewhere where you can choose to bring this in as a starting routine, where your different students will ask each other how they are and greet each other. And then, as you can see here, this is the recall activity that is linked to the lesson plan that I just showed you. So students ask their partner's name, comment t'appelles-tu, and introduce themselves, je m'appelle, to one another, which will revise the vocabulary. And as you can see, that is there supported for you in the slides. And we can't show you on this PowerPoint, but within the slides, when you click on those speech bubbles, that will then also give you the audio to support with the pronunciation as well. So this will, as you can see, the lesson plan really goes along with the slides as you go through the lesson. So moving on, we then have the presentation phase. So every lesson, usually because it's based around a sort of vocabulary set, will then have this presentation phase. Sometimes we will give you ideas for how you might want to present that. But in general, this will mean that you have the LanguageNut Learn screen, which has the vocabulary needed for that lesson within the slides. So as you can see, you can play the vocabulary so that the students get that target language read to them if you're not particularly confident with the vocabulary yourself. And you can also hit play and make those sort of bigger as flashcards as well. So if you want to introduce them on a bigger screen one by one, that's something that you can do too. Now, for those of you who are maybe not as comfortable with presenting vocabulary, haven't done it as much before, I've just got a few tips and ideas for the ways you might want to present them, and ways that you can do that with LanguageNut's Learn screen. So one thing that you can do by hitting the little I button there that I've got circled is you can hide the English translations. So one thing that you can do before we've been going through the vocabulary is to hide those translations and see if your students can work out the meaning of the words by either using the pictures or by looking for cognates, which are words in 2 languages that share a similar meaning, spelling and pronunciation. So on sandwich, you can see if you've got any students who could probably work out what that means in English as well. Another way that you could present the vocabulary before going through the meanings would be to play or read out the target language, so du jus or je bois, at random with the screen frozen, and see if the students can start to link the sounds of the language to the word. Another thing you can do as well is see if your pupils, this might be something that you do a little bit further down the line, possibly not with your sort of early doors year 3s, possibly, to see if students can actually guess the correct pronunciation of new vocabulary. So present the words on the board, and even if they're not entirely sure what they mean, see if they can work out what they think the pronunciation of the words would be before then showing them when you go through. I think once you've then presented it, Something that's really, really important for beginners when it comes to vocabulary learning is this sort of aspect of choral repetition, which is where students will listen carefully to the vocabulary or an item of vocabulary, repeat it after you or after the board if you're using the sound clips, and then get used to the way that you pronounce the word and the phrase that then they'll be using throughout the lesson. It's a really good way to build familiarity with the vocabulary and for building confidence, because everybody's repeating the words at the same time. We have various different games on the LanguageNut platform and within this course that you can play that with the choral repetition. Again, these will be going through, these will go through sort of in the webinar in a couple of weeks' time on the different games that we have in the platform. Quickly though, we've got 5 ideas for choral repetition. I've got a link to an article for these as well. So you can do delayed repetition. So you play the phrase or word, then wait 5 seconds and then decide on something like a click or a clap or a sound, and then the students repeat when they hear that sound. You can repeat and you can play the vocabulary and then get students to repeat it back to you but whispered. You can get them to close their eyes. Back chaining repetition would be where you take the last syllable. So if we look at des céréales, take the last syllable al, and then add the penultimate syllable to that, éal, céréales, des céréales, and they repeat once after you just to do it opposite and backwards. Or you can vary the group that you're getting to repeat after you. So you can say, you know, name half A of the class and half B of the class, side A repeats, then side B repeats. You can do it by tables, you can do it by boys and girls. However you want to vary the group, you can decide to do it that way just to create a little bit more interest as well. So that's the presentation phase, and that will form a large part of every lesson. After which you'll then have practice. And this quite often comes in the form of a LanguageNut game, which is then embedded into the slides. Because we know that different teachers might be pressed for time in terms of their LanguageNut lessons, we've basically planned all LanguageNut games to be front of class activities. However, if you do have access to devices, this would also be a point where you could get students playing this game either in pairs or on their own devices within the lesson. But we do embed the games into the lesson so that you can do it as a front of class activity as well. So an example of that would be with the vocabulary we just looked at. You might then have the matching pairs game at the beginning of the following lesson as a really cool activity where they can then come up to the board and drag and drop instead. And again, we'll be looking at ways that you can use these games as front of class activities in our gaming webinar in a couple of weeks. Finally, every single lesson will end with a plenary activity, which will essentially draw together everything that they've done in that lesson. And again, it will have its own slides. So if you just follow the instructions from the lesson plan in conjunction with the slides, that will take you through to the end. Before we got about 6 minutes left, we've got a couple of different types of lessons just to whiz through with you. One thing I wanted to draw your attention to was the sentence building weeks, as these follow quite a sort of set sort of formula and are very, very similar from sort of topic to topic. So as I mentioned before, with the sentence building weeks, we have slightly different activities because of the fact that they're based on sentences. Again, you can have a look at the sentences for the week through the Learn screen from the dashboard by clicking on the Learn screen. And you can also assign the sentences for the week. And this is, again, as I said, we do encourage this week to be a sort of competition where you do get ideally students out on devices or at least having a go at home to sort of really, really bring the skills that they've learned that term together. And with the lesson plans for the sentence building competition week, you will always have a recall and a presentation where students will first of all brainstorm anything that they've covered so far this term, either on mini whiteboards or as a group, and that will be in English. And then with your presentation phase, we have within the slides a list of the sentences that are in that lesson, where we would encourage you to begin with to see how many of those sentences students can work out in English based on their knowledge and understanding from what you've covered in that term. And you can see from the right hand side that you can then drag and drop those white boxes out of the way to reveal the answer. Again, if you're slightly less confident with the pronunciation, you can then go into the Learn screen, you can play them out, do some more choral repetition if you think it's necessary. But that is the general formula that this lesson follows. After which we as I said, we encourage practice through the various activities that you can assign. And the 3 activities that we have for sentence building are fridge magnets, where you drag and drop the words from a sentence into the correct order, dictation, where you can play the sentence, and type out what you think you've heard, and Skyrise, where it is a straight translation from English into the French. So they get progressively more difficult as you go along. And it's something that can really, really show that students have sort of built their understanding up as the term's gone on. Finally, we've got a couple of minutes and then we'll do some Q&A, is our culture lessons. As I mentioned with culture lessons, when you look at the learn screens for them, don't necessarily look at this and think, okay, right, I need all of the students to be able to produce La Basilique du Sacré-Cœur in exact sort of spelling. They're more there as a sort of sentence starter, as a sort of topic starter, and to get you thinking about that particular item of culture. And we do, for cultural lessons that include quite a lot of in-depth knowledge about that area, we do tend to, underneath the grammar hints section in our lesson plans, we will give you a bit more context for those. So in this case, you've got all of the different landmarks in Paris. Students will then go through an activity where they find those on Google Earth, and you can do it as a group activity or on devices, but you do also have the description of the landmarks in the lesson as well. So that was quite a whirlwind tour of the various different types of lesson that we have. I've mentioned a few times, as I said, do join us again on the 5th of October and then the following week as well, because we'll be going through more detail looking at the kinds of games that we have. So again, if you're looking to really sort of upskill and think about the kind of games that you might use and how to make the most of the games that we have on the course in your lessons, and do tune in for that one. And then the last one will be more to do with how you want to potentially stretch and challenge your students in the classroom, and that will be the following week. So do join us for that. I'm on holiday next week, so if you would like the if you have any questions, or if you'd like the slides, all of which have notes attached to them, do please drop my colleague Dave an email on dave@languagenut.com. He can share those with you, and we will share the recording of this webinar out once it's ready as well. And equally, if you want more information on how to do things like set up a competition, if you're having any issues with setting up your classes, or if you've joined us and you've never seen the product before and you'd like a trial, drop the support@languagenut.com an email, and we will get back to you as soon as possible with that information. Dave, do we have any questions in the chat at all?
Right, so we only have one question for you, and that question is, I'm teaching a mixed year group, year 5 and 6. What is your advice for which level to aim for?
So I do have a slide that includes our sort of suggestion for mixed year groups. The way that we've done the content is, while it does show a progression, in general, years 3 and 4 could be taught, in that order as a year group, and you do the first year of year 3 to begin with, and then repeat that first term of year 3 to begin in the beginning of year 4, the second year, and then carry on with that. With year 5 and 6, given that both years start with the revision and the greetings revision, I would say that, again, you can start with the year 5 content with a mixed class, and then the following year do the year 6 content. You will always do the greetings revision. I think it's absolutely fine to do it that way round. And generally speaking, if we include content in the lesson, for example, opinion vocabulary that will maybe have been covered before, it will still be added into the vocabulary for that lesson. So you can teach most lessons in isolation. Anything that includes revision will be included in the vocabulary for that lesson. I hope that makes sense. And to do, again, like, if you want a copy of this document, do let me know afterwards. Any other questions at all?
No, I think we've covered everything by the looks of it.
Okie dokie. Well, in that case, hopefully this has been useful, fairly short and sweet. I think hope you haven't taken up too much of your afternoon. As I said, do tune in to the webinars that we've got coming up over the next sort of month. And as I said, if you do have any questions at all, do feel free to drop us an email, and we'll do, where possible, do our best to get back to you as soon as possible with a solution.
We do have one question that's just come in. Sorry to interrupt. Can I see or access lesson plans at any time through the year? I look at lesson in term 4, in term 1.
Yeah, absolutely. You should be able to go into, so if you go into the dashboard, if I just go back to it, when you go to the dashboard for the year, You can click into any one of these lessons at any time, and you can download the lesson plans either as a pack from the knowledge organizer for that term, or as an individual lesson from the actual lesson itself. You don't have to be doing it in the exact order to be able to have access to it.
Great. I think that has answered all the questions then.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, do let us know. As I said, if anything occurs to you over the next half an hour or so, and you realise you didn't ask it, please do drop us an email. And if not, we hope you have a lovely evening, and hope to see you again soon.
Absolutely.